As a great rule of thumb in video games, the sequel is almost always better than the original. First we get Uncharted, pow, we get Uncharted 2. We get Gears of War 1, boosh, we get Gears of War 2. We get Devil May Cry 1, kapow, we get Devil May Cry 3. This makes perfect sense though. The first game's there to build the core mechanics and make sure the recipe is actually fun. And in the second game, they get to come along and just build mini games and new mechanics and polished graphics. And if you're a horrible company, you get to add loot boxes. Luckily for us, loot boxes is not something you're going to find in Rogue Legacy 2. In fact, you don't find that very often in any indie games. But what are the improvements and what are the changes from the first Rogue Legacy to the second? Let's roll our sleeves up and get into the specifics. One of the biggest and probably most noteworthy changes from Rogue Legacy 1 to 2 is the biomes in the game. In the first game, there was 4 primary biomes and a boss. Rogue Legacy 2, by contrast, looks to be twice as big. Of course, the game isn't quite complete yet, but you can see their plans and their roadmaps, and it looks like we're going to see around 6 to 8 different biomes with about as many bosses. But that isn't the only difference in the biomes. In the first game, the biomes were all very similarly laid out. They just had a different aesthetic from one biome to the next. By contrast, in Rogue Legacy 2, all biomes have a very distinct level layout. For instance, there's one biome that is just an outdoor area that's one long room from left to right. There's a winter biome that has more up and down level layouts. There's a library, there's a castle. But the important thing is it's not just aesthetics that make the difference from one biome to the next in Rogue Legacy 2. There's also a significant layout difference between each biome. The class system is another significant difference from the first game to the second and is a noteworthy improvement this time around. In the first Rogue Legacy, all of the classes kind of blended together. It was mostly stat differences that made the difference from one class to another. The mage was better at magic but had less HP and couldn't hit quite as hard. The shinobi was a class that could hit really hard but couldn't critical and had less health. The barbarian had lots of health but didn't hit very hard. All of these differences had to do more with the attributes of the character and less how each individual character class played. Rogue Legacy 2 changes this system entirely. The only thing that you can bet on from one character class to the next is that they all jump and they all move. Aside from that, their attacks can be, and in many cases are, extremely different. For instance, the chef has a pan, but that pan doesn't have very long reach. The nice thing about this pan though is enemy projectiles, when hit, reflect and can do damage back on the enemy. The barbarian this time around, while yes, they have lots of health and don't quite hit quite as hard, have very unique attacks. When it goes to attack, there's a few extra frames that go into its attack animation, so you have to plan before you take that swing or you might take damage yourself. The barbarian also doesn't have a conventional jump attack. If you jump and attack while you're in the air, you go into a spin, one that you can't change. So you need to be very careful about how you approach every enemy situation, or else the barbarian is going to be quite the reckless class to play. But it's not just these distinct differences that Rogue Legacy 2 has brought. Rogue Legacy 2 also has more classes. While it's true they haven't finished adding classes at this point, but the original game had 8 base classes and 2 secret ones. Rogue Legacy 2 at this point already has 9 regular classes, and they have promised more upcoming. The class system is significantly improved over the original game. An obvious but very important change to note from the first game to the second is the graphical style. The first game went for a pixel art style, and some people were very sour on that choice. The second game uses an illustrated style, and they do this by making the graphics in a 3-dimensional space and then rigging 2-dimensional sprites onto those 3-dimensional objects. This allows very fluid animations throughout the game, but nonetheless, there have now been contrarians that dislike the new illustrated look. Having played both games, I really don't have a preference between these two styles. I like the animations in the new one, but it also was a really nice throwback to see the pixel art style in the original. Boss is another facet that has been drastically improved from the first game to the second. Let's quickly recap the bosses from the first game. We have an eyeball, a flaming skull, a flaming sphere, and a slime. Really, these bosses are not particularly creative. Luckily, how they played in the game was very fun and very creative in that, but there wasn't a lot to these bosses. They weren't graphically impressive and they weren't very detailed in how they operated. That all has changed in Rogue Legacy 2. With only 4 bosses in the first game, the new game looks to be promising at least 6 bosses. Hopefully we're going to get some hidden ones and an end boss as well, but each boss that we've come up against so far has been very creative and very detailed in how it's been presented. Instead of fighting a motionless giant eyeball, now we're fighting undead skeleton lords and bosses that live in flowers and big giant magi that are running around casting spells on you. Their attack patterns are more complicated, their movement powers are more complicated, their appearances are better. In every single part of what makes the bosses in Rogue Legacy 2, there have been improvements. A lot of the miscellaneous systems between the two games have also changed. Rogue Legacy 1 had a carnival mechanism where you'd play an axe throwing game, or a guess the treasure box game, or a dagger throwing game. Those games have been removed, but in their place there are a number of special rooms that you'll find yourself in as you travel throughout the game. Recently, they have added challenge rooms that give you a special portal door where you go in and are challenged with a number of different enemy encounters that, just like the name, will challenge you, and you are rewarded if you clean all of them out. There's also an heirloom system where certain magical items are hidden throughout the game, some of which are necessary to complete the game that you'll have to find and overcome a challenging event to obtain that magical item. Heirlooms in the game are permanent. Once you have completed the challenge, you get to keep that item forever. There are also relics in the game, and this is a facet that has been changing quite a bit since the game has originally come out to early access, so the relic system may see some changes, but right now what relics do is they modify your character to allow you to do different things or specialize in certain things. Beyond these changes, there are also a number of miscellaneous quality of life changes from Rogue Legacy 1 to Rogue Legacy 2. Most notable among these changes is the unlocking of warp points. In certain cases, when you get to a warp spot, if you have enough money, you can pay that money to unlock that point permanently. With so many biomes, this became very necessary so the player can go from one side of all of this massive system of biomes to the other without having to fight your way through it every single time. In a way, this has become necessary because the enemies in the first area aren't worth as much to the player, and so fighting through them just becomes grindy and a little bit redundant when you want to go 3 biomes over and fight the enemies there that are more difficult and more important to the task that you have at hand. The armor and relic systems have also been upgraded in the new sequel. Armor in this game, when you acquire blueprints, can be unlocked much like the first game, but you can also level it up by acquiring metal throughout the game. This allows you to pick your favorite set and then specialize in that set if you choose, so you can wear lighter armor and still get good qualities out of that armor. The relics are very similar. You have to unlock them at the Enchantress, but once you've done that and you have the available materials necessary, you can upgrade your relics to make them more effective. All in all, the takeaway here is that Rogue Legacy 2 is doing almost all of the same things as the first game, it's just doing them bigger and better and more polished. Everything that I have seen of this game makes me think that this is going to be the next big roguelite once it hits version 1 sometime in 2021. As always, thanks for hanging out with me, and until next time, this has been Pixel.